Just ahead, there's another edition of the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's talk and entertainment networks and in the Orlando area of Tough TV 38. I'm Reagan Smith, Public Affairs Director of the Florida News Network.
I'm political commentator Al Spry. We have a fun topic today along with some serious talk, and we are going to have a book about presidential drinking, Reagan.
Journalist Mark Will Weber will be joining us, revealing how alcohol has steered the course of American history. Some interesting tales that I think you're going to enjoy. So pull up a chair, put an ear on the radio. The Florida Roundtable begins following these messages. This is the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's talk and entertainment networks, and in the Orlando area, we are seen on Tough TV 38. I'm Reagan Smith, Public Affairs Director of the Florida News Network.
And I'm political analyst Al Spry. We have a lot to talk about today. And, of course, we're going to do some lighter stuff in a little bit with Mark Will Weber, who wrote a book about presidential drinks and drinking, which is kind of fun. So we are in the aftermath of the Ferguson fallout that happened a few days ago. Of course, the decision not to indict the white officer, Darren Wilson, 28, for firing 6 shots this past August in a confrontation that killed an unarmed black gentleman, 18-year-old Michael Brown. So I just want to say the following. First off, about it. These are issues that are going to keep cropping up. Of course, they cropped up about 20 years ago in L.A. They crop up from time to time in various communities, and I don't think violence is ever the answer. I think the rioting does a disservice to the cause and to the people, and we need leaders. We need strong leaders from communities who are in ways being persecuted by police. And I think that this does occur. I don't think the police are always right, and I don't think the police are always the good guys, only from just looking at history. Reagan?
Oh, I absolutely agree with you. And I think that what we ought to be looking for and at are those people who can organize and do peaceful demonstration and protest. And while you protest the system, it is possible to work within it and make those protests without destruction of property and violence.
I agree. I think the only way to really enact and affect real change is to work within the system. We've seen that.
Even Adolf Hitler knew that.
Right.
And that's how he got into it.
It's funny. I was just thinking that. You read my mind that he tried to do a revolution in Germany, and it failed, and then he worked within the system and gained power. Now, I want to say that these are issues that have been cropping up for 50 years. It seems like we're replaying the 1960s again to a certain degree. And I think people need to take a good look and stop looking the other way. And I think most people do look the other way, Reagan. I think there's a lot of apathy out there, and there's a lot of, shall we say, unwillingness to face the truth of socioeconomic conditions, of conditions of racism that do exist in America, although we like to pretend we're a post-racial country. That's a bunch of bunk. And we need to look at police power and the use of power. I'm not even speaking in the specific case of Ferguson, although there are some questions still lingering from that.
Sure there.
But I think if we don't face these issues head on and with courage and with the ability to merit out justice, no matter where it be, we're going to keep seeing this replaying over and over again.
We will. I'll share a story that I told you earlier before we got into this, and that is a video presentation that I use at UCF on the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. that features Coretta Scott King and his daughter Yolanda. Mm-hmm. And she said at the time when she found that her father had been shot to death and all the rioting started in the various 130 cities across the country had serious problems that night. And she says she thought that it was a slap in her father's face for them to behave like that.
Well,
And
the reason why she probably feels that way, I would think, not to put myself in her place, but I would think that, when you riot, when you cause destruction, then the people in power and the people in the higher socioeconomic status can point to you and say, look, they're just rioting, so we were right the whole time. And so I think when King started his nonviolence movement, following the footsteps of Gandhi, they both said nonviolence is the way to go.
yeah. On that note, we need to take a pause along our network line here. We'll remind you that this is the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks, and in the Orlando area on Tough TV 38. I'm Reagan Smith.
I'm Al Spry.
And if you will stay put, we will be joined by Mark Will Weber. He is the author of Mint Juleps with Teddy Roosevelt. We'll get him to explain that one as our conversation continues. We're back. You're listening to the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks, and in the Orlando area on Tough TV 38. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
And Al, as promised, we are joined on the long-distance phone at this point by Mark Will Weber, who has got a brand new book from Reagan Publishing, The Complete History of Presidential Drinking. It is Mint Juleps with Teddy Roosevelt. Wow. Mark, welcome to the Florida Roundtable.
It kind of sounds fun to have mint juleps with Teddy Roosevelt. Hi, Mark. How are you?
I'm doing fine. Thanks for having me on your show.
Before we can talk about Teddy Roosevelt for the whole hour with this, but before we even do that, let me ask you, first, tell us a little bit about your personal background, your journalistic background and whatnot, and then how it is that you came to put this book together.
Well, my background, I've been a journalist for the better part of the last 40 years, and I started in newspapers, police beat and obits, the whole thing, and then got into sports, and eventually ended up at Runner's World magazine. And in fact, I've been in Orlando a bunch of times involved with the Disney Marathon as a panelist and as a runner. But obviously, this book is a completely different turn for me. My first three books were about long-distance running in the Olympics and things like that, and I just wanted to do something different. And the seed for this book, the germ for this book, actually comes from an incident where Warren Harding, during Prohibition, nobody's supposed to drink or transport alcohol, and Harding would go out onto the golf course at Chevy Chase usually, and he would stash a fifth of whiskey in his golf bag, and every couple holes he'd take a pop of whiskey, and it might explain why Harding rarely broke 100 on the golf course.
Well, I think that's interesting. Continue.
Yeah, and I'm not a golfer, but my friend read that little excerpt from a book called First Off the Tee, which is about the presidents that golfed. And he turns to me and he says, "You know what? That's great." He goes, "I want to know what all these guys drank." He goes, "You're a writer. Why don't you do it?" So I kind of put him off for a year, and then he kept bugging me. And I said, finally, to get him off my back, I said, "Look, I'm going to do the guys that didn't drink much, and if they're interesting, I'll keep going." And I found that even the ones that didn't imbibe heavily had an interesting story about them and alcohol. So once I did those guys, I kept going on to the Trumans and such.
Well, I think alcohol is woven into American society so much. I remember they tried to ban it back in the about 100 years ago, and that flopped pretty badly. And of course, with Prohibition. And but the founding fathers, who we like to think of as these guys on a hill, they like to have a good drink. They like to have a good time. According to this here, George Washington's favorite foxhounds were named Drunkard, Tippler, and Tipsy. Is that right?
And I thought
I love
was
that.
Funny when I found that, because the knock against Washington, if you read a lot of his biographies, is that the people that didn't care for Washington describe him as cold and humorless, and obviously a guy has to have a little bit of sense of humor to name his foxhounds that.
Of course.
The other thing that's well documented is that Washington, once he had a couple champagnes, he was much more affable and open. Actually, he's one of the few presidents that alcohol probably had a positive effect on.
Because he was so tightly wound otherwise, probably, right? Being the
yes, and the other explanation, they would say, oh, he rarely smiled, but the explanation for that is that Washington had bad teeth, and then like a lot of people that aren't comfortable with their teeth tend not to smile. So he had artificial teeth, I think. A lot of his biographers will tell you. And some of that may have come from the fact that he liked to drink this porter beer made in Philadelphia that was laced with molasses. That was one of his favorite drinks, that and Madeira wine.
That's not really good for the teeth, correct?
No, I wouldn't think so. And, of course, you can imagine what their dental hygiene was like back then anyway. But, you know, what's also interesting is that Washington sold whiskey, and they've recreated his still at Mount Vernon.
Wasn't he the largest distributor, largest producer of high alcohol whiskey at the time, or one of the largest, right?
Yes, it was, and interesting enough, he had put down the Whiskey Rebellion 2 or 3 years before that, so I don't know whether it's coincidental or not, but he basically knocked out a lot of the competition prior to that. And then he had a Scottish overseer guy by the name of Anderson who knew how to make this stuff, and Anderson really implored him to go into the whiskey business, and he said, I know how to do it, and they had the slaves did all the hard labor. And sure enough, they were pumping out a lot of whiskey, and they sold it off the back of wagons in Alexandria, Virginia.
One of the things that we should point out, because of the abundance of corn and the material for whiskey production early on, and horrible transportation systems in the early states or previous in the colonies, alcoholism has always been a very serious problem in North America, going back, when it was just the French and the British, and in the early days of the United States, this women's temperance movement grew and grew, and these guys didn't sit around at home at night staring into the candle. They got their jug, and it was public drunkenness was very common, So, anyways.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I found interesting, too, as I researched this book, is that you had a real divide between certain presidents and certain congressmen and senators, in that Jefferson, for example, was very much against the spread of whiskey. He saw whiskey, he called it the bane of whiskey, and he felt that wine, reasonably priced wine, was a much smarter, more cultural way to go. And, of course, he got all that from his time in France, where he saw that wine was part of the culture, but very little drunkenness comparatively. And so Jefferson and some of his disciples, like Madison and Monroe, were all wine guys, and they wanted to pressure the government to tax whiskey much heavier than wine and try to get reasonably priced wine into the hands of the average guy rather than whiskey.
Now, was it Jefferson that, he had so much wine and he loved it so much, he spent a lot of money on it, and it very nearly pushed him into a bankruptcy?
It definitely did, and it would be more accurate to say that his lavish entertaining, of which wine certainly was a part of it, and I don't think Jefferson drank all that wine himself, but he was very generous. He would give dinner parties with 20 people almost every other day, and of course they would go through a lot of wine.
He was quite a party guy. 500 bottles of champagne over the course of a year for the White House. It was called the Executive Mansion at the time. But.
Exactly. He one year calculated that he was very meticulous about keeping track of what they went through in a year. So if you read his little log books, his farm book and things like that, he would say, well, we went through 423 bottles of champagne last year. And then he'd cross that out and order 500. He always rounded up for the next year. And it's certainly true that he was close to bankruptcy near the end of his life. And in fact, he rescued himself once by selling his personal library to the U.S. government, because if you recall, when the British burnt Washington, they also burnt the Library of Congress. So to restart the Library of Congress, the government bought Jefferson's book collection for about $25,000.
We also have had a couple of presidents that had alcohol problems, and I'm thinking in terms of the years just before Abraham Lincoln.
Absolutely. The poster boy for alcohol abuse among the presidents has to be Franklin Pierce, who is the only president from New Hampshire. And Pierce died of cirrhosis of the liver. I think he was in his early 60s. So we know for a fact that he overindulged. Now, he had a very sad life, I should say, because people go, oh, yeah, Pierce was a drunk, and dismiss it at that. But he lost two of his children before they even turned 2, which was not uncommon in that day and age. And then they had a boy that lived to about 10, Benny, and they loved this boy, you can imagine, because their other 2 children had died. And unfortunately, they were in a horrific train crash. Pierce had already been elected, but he hadn't taken office yet. It was between the inauguration day and his election day. And a lot of people were hurt in this train crash, and his son was thrown from the train, and he was the only one that was killed. And Pierce had to scramble down a snowbank and retrieve his body and bring it back up to the train. And his wife got it in her head that God was punishing them because Pierce had accepted the presidency. And she spent a lot of his term up in her bedroom writing letters to the dead son.
Wow, that's pretty heavy.
Yeah, so if that doesn't make you want to have a drink or two, I'm not sure what would.
And I guess this quote's attributed to Pierce. There's nothing for ex-presidents to do but get drunk when his party failed to back him for a second term.
Yes, and I'm not quite sure, and I probably allude to it as such in the book, that it's positive that he said that, but it
sounds about right.
The lore that went around Congress, and I think it started with Henry Cabot Lodge Sr., and Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. used to banter it about, so it has gone down through history as something that Pierce said, and it's not improbable that he might have said that.
A word before we have to take a pause, I wanted to get a story in here about one of our most volatile presidents, known for his flaring temper. What about Andrew Jackson?
Andrew Jackson's an incredible guy to read about. I mean, he's our only president that killed somebody else in a duel. And he liked to gamble on fighting cocks and horses and so on and so forth as a younger man. But at the time he gets to be president, he's slowed down a little bit. He's got bullets in his body from his duels, and he just lost his beloved wife, and he's in his latter years. But like Washington, he also sold whiskey at the Hermitage. So when you go through his letters, you'll see these great letters where somebody makes him a pair of beautiful pistols, and he says, stop by the still and help yourself to as much whiskey as you might want or require.
Love that.
Absolutely amazing.
That's great.
We are talking with Mark Will Weber, a historian with a brand new book, Mint Juleps with Teddy Roosevelt, The Complete History of Presidential Drinking. Well, we've covered some of the early years. This is from our friends at Regnery History, and we presume it's available at all the fine bookstores around Florida and places like Amazon.com. Just chock full of information about your favorite president. You'll say, I never knew that. And so I'll tell you what, we're going to continue to explore some of the timeline of our history and our presidential drinking. You're listening to the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm slightly inebriated Al Spry.
Back in a moment. From Pensacola to Key West and all points in between, you're listening to the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
Our very special guest this day, Mark Will Weber. He is the author of a brand new book from Regnery History, Mint Juleps with Teddy Roosevelt, The Complete History of Presidential Drinking.
By the way, I'm not really inebriated during the interview. I'm just that was a joke, folks. So before you write your emails and stuff and call and get all,
Yeah,
Why is Al Spry doing radio inebriated?
That explains some of the crazy things he says. I go, oh, well.
Yeah, people just shake their heads and go, oh, that Al Spry.
Anyways.
So let's talk about a president who went to his inauguration while he was drunk. And that, of course, is the president who followed after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. That's Andrew Johnson.
Yes, Andrew Johnson, as vice president at Lincoln's second inaugural, he had been sick and he didn't really want to attend, and Lincoln sort of insisted that he come all the way from Tennessee and attend this inauguration. And he arrived in the city, and as was the tendency in that day, they used alcohol a lot for medicinal purposes. So if you had a cold or the flu or something like that, you brought out the bottle of brandy or whiskey and tried to treat it that way. So apparently he got a little carried away the night before, and the next morning he still didn't feel that great, and he unwisely opted for what I call the hair of the dog strategy. So he decided to have a couple more, and by the time he got up to give what was supposed to be a 5-minute talk, he rambled on for 17, 18 minutes. And he often became verbally combative with people in the crowd when he drank too much, Johnson. So they had to give him the equivalent of the Broadway hook. And Lincoln was said to have been so embarrassed that he was trying to slink his 6'4" frame further down in his chair as Johnson was up there rambling on like a maniac. And it haunted Johnson for the rest of his political career. His enemies would often refer to him as the drunken little tailor, that kind of thing.
Well, they also impeached him.
Yes, they did impeach him. He narrowly escaped removal by one vote in the Senate, which is a great story. And true to form, what he did when one of his guys raced all the way from the Capitol to the White House, it was about a mile, and he burst in and saw Johnson surrounded with a bunch of his cronies, and he said, "Mr. President, you've been acquitted." And they immediately called for the best whiskey to come up with out of the White House cellar. And
I think I would, too.
Yeah, absolutely.
I would, too.
Yeah.
I just thought about this. A couple of campaigns that had hard cider as their themes. Going back to William Henry Harrison, who was not a drunk, gives the longest inaugural in the history of the country, standing in a cold rain, catches pneumonia, and 30 days later he's dead, making him the shortest-serving president. But he ran what they called a jolly hard cider camp. He was born in a mansion. They said, oh, he's born in a log cabin, and he's a drinker. Identify with a common man. And years later, the grandson, Benjamin Harrison, runs for president, and they try to run him on his granddaddy's coattails, including the drinking.
Right. It's a really interesting sort of side issue of this book that when you see the rhetoric, what I call the rhetoric of alcohol in campaigns. In other words, you alluded to it, that they made Harrison sound like he was a drinker, so he would appeal to the common guy. It actually started as a slur against him. A Baltimore newspaper said, "I guarantee that if you give Harrison a log cabin and a jug of hard cider, he'll retire for the rest of his life." And instead of being insulted by it, they turned around and used it as a positive, and they painted his opponent, Van Buren, as this champagne-sipping aristocrat. And that's one of the interesting aspects of this book, where politically you don't necessarily want to be seen as a non-drinker. It can almost be as hazardous as being labeled a drunk. In other words, look at this last election where Romney, because of his Mormon faith, obviously can't be seen drinking. And if you notice during the vice president's talk, Ryan, the candidate, Ryan was quick to say, "Hey, I love these beers from Wisconsin." They were trying to say, "No, wait a minute, we have a cool guy in our ticket too." So
it wasn't enough,
really
though. It wasn't enough to have a total teetotaler as running for president. I think maybe that's the answer, among other things. But it's interesting.
It can't be done in modern times, I don't think, and it's almost impossible to satisfy everybody, of course. But you want your candidate to seem cool, and Reagan understood this. Reagan often took advantage of what I call the alcohol photo op, and that he'd be seen having a Guinness on St. Patrick's Day, but he rarely finished it. He'd have 2 or 3 sips. But they'd have a picture of him in some working-class bar, some Irish bar, having a Guinness.
I want to ask you this. Was Ulysses S. Grant, who became president, was he as drunk as everyone claimed that he was?
I often get asked this question when people go, well, hey, Grant was a big drinker, right? And the answer to that is that the best answer, I believe, is that Grant was a bad drinker. Grant had very low tolerance. We see this guy on the 50, he looks burly and looks like he could handle his alcohol. But in fact, when he was a young officer in the Mexican War, Grant was about 130 pounds and maybe 5'7". So he wasn't a big guy, and he had very low tolerance. We have definite evidence from some of his other generals, friends of his even, that said 1 glass of whiskey would show on Grant's face. His face would become flushed. And then he also wanted more. So Grant was a bad drinker. He had low tolerance, as did Richard Nixon. We might get to him later. So Grant could not drink very well. And he knew it, and he could sometimes go weeks without a drink. But once he had one, he wanted more.
I guess a man who could drink very well was Harry Truman. He had 2 or 3 ounce shots of bourbon every morning, along with a brisk walk and a rub down.
Yeah, that's called the Al Spry plan. We're just kidding. But no, Truman, when you read that, because at first people are like, what? The president is drinking bourbon in the morning? You got to be kidding me. But when you read how it was done and the ritual of it, it definitely rings as a medicinal sort of old wives' tale. In other words, somebody probably said to him back in Missouri, if you have a shot of bourbon every morning, you'll never catch a cold all winter, that kind of thing. So yeah, he would take a quick walk, and they said that he really moved along on his walk. It was like power walking. And then I think this is the right order. He'd have his bourbon, and then he'd get a rub down, and then he'd begin his presidential day. Now, don't get me wrong, Harry also liked to have bourbon later in the day.
Yes. But the history books conveniently leave out the bourbon in the morning part of it. But when we were talking about Grant, Abraham Lincoln had the answer to Grant's drinking. And when he nearly lost the Battle of Shiloh, a committee of congressmen went to the president and demanded they fire Grant. They said, he's drinking again. And President Lincoln responded, I want you to find out what brand it is he drinks so I can send a case to all of my other generals. I can't spare this man. He fights.
Right. And there is some question of whether that actually happened, but it's so ingrained in history, and it sounds so Lincoln-esque that it is pretty much accepted as part of the fabric. Let's put it that way. But if you read, for instance, Team Arrivals by Dolores is it Goodwin?
Doris Goodwin,
Pulitzer Prize winner, but she tiptoes around that in her book. She says a story was circulated that Lincoln said this, but there seems to be little evidence that it was actually said, but we love that story so much we can't get away from it.
Real quick, I want to fast forward to Nixon. What's it mean to pull a Nixon? What does that mean?
To pull a Nixon has been accused of drinking Lafitte Rothschild, which even in the 70s was probably a $400 or $500 bottle of wine. Why he instructed his staffers to serve a $6 bottle of wine to his dinner guests and to wrap a towel around the label so that they couldn't see it. And so if you do that at home, you save the top shelf stuff for yourself.
Well, we had Nixon's one of his aides, Roger Stone, on the show a few weeks ago, and Nixon liked certain type of he liked martinis, and it was a certain type of martini that Winston Churchill popularized, where you soak the olives in the vermouth, and then you just put the olives and you serve it straight up. So that's a Nixon martini. I didn't know if you knew about that one or not.
I did not, and if I would love to have you guys connect me with him if I do a round 2 here. If hopefully our first printing sells out, I could update the book, and I would gladly add that little tidbit.
Absolutely.
All right, it is time for us to take another pause along the network line here. Let us remind you that you are listening to the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks. I'm Reagan Smith.
I'm Al Spry.
Our very special guest is Mark Will Weber. He is the author of Mint Juleps with Teddy Roosevelt, The Complete History of Presidential Drinking. It's from our friends at Regnery History Publishing, available at all the fine bookstores around Florida and places like Amazon.com. And one of the things we haven't touched upon just yet, that I would like to do when we come back to our conversation, is Teddy Roosevelt. Mint Juleps with Teddy Roosevelt. How did we get that association, and what made it the title of the book? So stay put. Our conversation continues following these messages. We are back. You're listening to the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
And our very special guest is Mark Will Weber. His brand new book, Mint Juleps with Teddy Roosevelt, The Complete History of Presidential Drinking, from our friends at Regnery History, available at all the fine bookstores around Florida and places like Amazon.com. And Mark, before we have to run away here, the title itself, Mint Juleps with Teddy Roosevelt, how did we get that one?
Well, there's this nice little scenario, good story about Teddy and the mint juleps that we settled upon for the title, because Teddy had a fine, fresh bed of mint at the White House, and he also had a tennis court, and he loved to play tennis, but he had difficulty getting any of his cabinet members to play, and he would play in the rain. He was very gung-ho like that, as Teddy was about anything that he did, whether it was hunting or politics. He always went full bore. So once he got the tennis bug, he wanted to play all the time, and his tennis, the guys became known as the tennis cabinet because he basically forced them to play. But he used these mint juleps as enticements to get these guys to play tennis with him. He would say, come play 2 or 3 sets, and then he would serve them these delicious mint juleps. His steward would make them, Pinckney, and then he would take them out and hand them to the players, and they'd say, "Thank you, Mr. President," and he'd say, "Delighted," and give him the big Teddy Roosevelt grin. You can almost picture it. And they became known as the tennis cabinet.
That's a great story. And how did you decide this was going to be the title of the book?
We kind of went back and forth on various things, and originally the subtitle, which admittedly is very important to say what the book's about, The Complete History of Presidential Drinking. We had various titles like that to begin with, but we just didn't feel like it had the hook. It was almost too general. And then we thought of maybe combining the two to come up with hopefully what is a very intriguing title.
What about FDR? Did he like to drink?
FDR drank a lot, and actually Teddy Roosevelt was quite moderate in his drinking, I should say, because his side of the family had lots of alcohol problems. His brother was a complete alcoholic, and I think at least one of his sons was. And FDR had great tolerance. He was sort of like Buchanan. He could drink a lot and not show it. And we always associate FDR with the cocktail and the martini, which is true. He did like those, and he liked to make them. But he also liked beer, and I didn't know this before I delved into his background, but he loved to play poker. So if FDR was in an all-night card game from, say, 10 to 2 in the morning, he would often have 4 or 5 beers in that stretch of time. And when he went sailing, he liked to have rum daiquiris, or rum swizzles, I should say.
One of the great stories I remember reading about Dwight Eisenhower, General Eisenhower's out at the farm at Gettysburg, and they've got one of those gas grills, and they're going to do a barbecue thing, and they can't get the gas-fired grill going. And finally, Eisenhower he's had it, and he says, "Oh, the hell with it," and they go and start drinking Dewar's. He had it. Again,
that's something I could include in round 2 if I could track that one down.
What about the empty champagne bottle that may be hidden inside the walls of the White House? What's the story on that?
Well, that comes during Rutherford B. Hayes' time, and as you know, the Hayes banned all alcohol from the White House during that time, and the First Lady became known as Lemonade Lucy. Although there are interesting stories around that where people were constantly trying to sneak alcohol in and out. But the champagne bottle in particular, the workmen were tearing up a wall, and before they sealed it back up, the staffers decided as a joke to write on the label of an empty bottle to put the Hayes administration's date on there and stick it back in, thinking it would be great fun when 100 years from now somebody discovered it in there. So that's where
funny.
That came from.
That's fun. What about the current occupant of the White House, President Obama? What's his favorite drinking regime?
Obama is a very he likes a wide array of alcohol. He doesn't drink to excess, I would say. He's very much like Reagan and Clinton in that he understands the value of the alcohol photo op. But he drinks, they make their own beer there, the White House Honey Ale. They use honey from Michelle Obama's beehives to make the beer. And he also likes really good California wines, as did Mr. Reagan. And he, if we believe David Remnick from the New Yorker magazine, he also likes some late-night martinis.
Ah, okay. Well, with that, on that note, we are going to have to call a halt to the proceedings here, but what a delightful book. Mark Will Weber, 5 stars from here for this. Probably some stories that some of the presidents would sooner have never gotten out, but they are fact. Mint Juleps with Teddy Roosevelt, the complete history of presidential drinking. It is from our friends at Regnery History, and it's available at all the fine bookstores around the state of Florida and places like Amazon.com. A wonderful coffee table type book. Pick it up, give it a read, have some fun. Astound your friends or fellow workers around the water cooler with the stories of the imbibing habits of our various presidents. Mark, thank you so much. I'm Reagan Smith.
I'm Al Spry.
And we will continue our conversation with a closing thought in a moment. We are back. You're listening to the Florida Roundtable, the service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks, and in the Orlando area on Tough TV 38. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
And boy, it was fun having Mark Will Weber on with us.
Yeah.
And, it's nice to know that our presidents, the vast majority of them, have not been afraid to take a little taste.
That they're human.
That
they're human.
That's right.
A couple of resignations. First off, one of the people we've had on the show, Michael Cruz, who has not been in the job that long, relatively, Secretary of the Florida Department of Corrections, announced he would step down following months of scrutiny involving abusive corrections officers, suspicious inmate deaths, and a poor record of inmate health care delivered by private contractors. Hey, you remember what he said when he was on?
Yeah.
He said all this was going to change. He was going to do the job, and it was going to be we're going to have great success in changing the prison system. Obviously, this did not happen.
Got to be too much, and he said, not doing it.
Yep.
That's it.
Also, we have the abrupt resignation of the Castleberry police chief. This is in Central Florida. This is Bill McNeil, who's with the department for 26 years. According to this article, 3 more people will join a lawsuit that accuses this gentleman, former police chief, of sexually harassing 2 female officers and making derogatory remarks to a Hispanic officer. That means 6 people, including 2 current officers and a former officer, will be accusing ex-police chief William McNeil of creating a hostile work environment for city employees while he served as Castleberry's top cop.
Well, I think, he abruptly resigned, and we'll see if charges are brought. And sometimes you have no choice. The evidence is there, and you have to
go.
Well,
yes, and it goes back to what I said at the beginning of the show, and that is that, I have respect for law enforcement. I have respect for what they do. It's a tough job. It doesn't pay very well, but there are cops who go bad, and these cops need to be held accountable. They are not any different than any other person who. In fact, I think they should be held to a higher standard.
Well, absolutely. And short personal story. Many, many years ago, I was the community relations director of a suburb of Cleveland. And while I was in that office, the police department was investigating itself and found 2 of their young officers who, in their off-duty time, were running a chop shop and taking in stolen cars. the staff of the city hall was called in, and we were all sent to the basement, and the two officers were called in from the road. They were both known, had reputations for having tempers, and so they were afraid that perhaps they would lose their tempers, but they were brought into the city hall, and they were arrested in the mayor's office. Without any violence, fortunately for us. But so, any profession, you're going to find some bad apples, and certainly the police are no different than anybody else. Well, it is time for us to call a halt to the proceedings for this week. We do want to thank you for your time. Kind of run up the white flag here. Al and I could just go ahead. We'll take over the stations for another hour if they let us. Sure, no, we wouldn't do that. But we do thank you. We know you have lots of choices out there, and we're always delighted when you decide to spend a few minutes with us. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
And we'll see you again next week with another edition of the Florida Roundtable.
You've been listening to Florida Roundtable, a weekly look at issues and problems of concern to Floridians from a state, national, and international perspective. Presented by the Florida News Network with your hosts, Reagan Smith and Al Spry. The views and opinions expressed during the preceding program are solely those of the participants and not necessarily those of this station's ownership, management, or sponsors of FNN. Your views and opinions are welcome. Address your card or letter to Florida Roundtable in care of Reagan Smith, 2500 Maitland Center Parkway, Suite 407, Maitland, Florida, 32751. Or you may email reagansmith@fnnonline.com. Thank you for listening, and please join us again next week for another edition of Florida Roundtable.